Kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
I thought this morning we had decided roughly a week ago to do this about the demise of the trade unions and the actual unintended consequences that has had. But then just thinking about the last week has been incredibly momentous in the sense that, number one, we are seeing a massive surge in COVID-19 cases across the Northern Hemisphere. So a massive increase in the epidemic. So we could talk about that, but I think we all understand roughly what that means. The second thing, obviously, that goes with that is we've seen the first vaccine announced, and it seems to be extremely effective, and therefore it looks like something like herd immunity through immunization is possible very soon. So another very momentous announcement. And now we'll come in third place to the fact that we've got a new president elect in the United States. And we've got, for the first time in, well, I guess in centuries, we've got a contested election in the United States. So that's also a momentous issue, but I think that there's more than enough of that on the TV screens. And then, of course, I was watching BBC Africa yesterday, and they thought that the arrest of Ace Magashule didn't make it onto their news bulletin. But for us, an incredibly important announcement. So for those of you who have followed the political stuff, what we've been saying all along is we will really think that Cyril Ramaphosa is actually in control in South Africa when we see Ace Magashule arrested. Now, we've now seen that. So we will obviously have to watch carefully to see what the reaction to this is and whether the decision by the NEC that all accused members of the ANC need to step back from their posts, whether they actually follow through with that in the Magashule instance. But you have every reason to think that Cyril pushed that through in anticipation of Ace's arrest, rather than that Ace's arrest was a random event afterwards. So lots and lots of very important things happening, and also markets reacting to that. We actually thought that the best investment idea of the week was that we should buy shares in a local TV or radio station in Georgia. So for those of you who have not been following CNN or Fox News or any of the American news channels assiduously, there are two runoff elections for the Senate in Georgia on the 5th of January. And that will decide the balance in the Senate in the US. And therefore, the most desired media space in the world over the next month and a half will be media space in Georgia, because you will not believe how much money both the Democrats and the Republicans will throw at those two Senate races. But what I wanted to discuss today is actually something that is less obvious, and I think it also it sheds some light on the whole American political scene, but also the worldwide political scene. And it's something that is often missed because it's not so obvious. And I was talking this week with my daughter who's writing her final economics exams for a degree at Stellenbosch about path dependency. Now, that's an academic term that basically just says that history matters, that you never operate in a vacuum where everything starts from an objective, neutral spot, and you now have some forces working on that. History is always with you, and the consequences of history is always with you. And one of the things that we know is that many things have unintended consequences. So what I want to do today is just go back to to the late part of the 20th century to see the history that was behind a lot of what we're seeing today in politics. So the first thing I want to go to is in the 1980s, we basically see a breakdown of the compact between labor and business that existed in the Western world through the 1950s and 60s. So what you will remember is that effectively through the 1950s and 60s and 70s, in most Western countries, we had two big parties, a center-left party and a center-right party. So in Britain, you would have the Conservative Party, who would be fully in support of the National Health Service, so something that you would really regard as something socialist, and you would have the Labour Party, who would also govern from time to time. And effectively, the difference between the two parties would be so small that you really, in the economic statistics, etc., you could hardly notice when the one party stopped governing and the other party started governing. Now, that whole peaceful coexistence started breaking down in the 1980s, and the first real symptom of this was Thatcherism, where in effect the centre-right party in the UK became a right party rather than a centre-right party. So effectively, Margaret Thatcher moved the Conservative Party very significantly to the right, and one of the seminal events in her rule was the confrontation with the union that controlled coal mining in Britain. So some of you may be old enough to remember a guy called Arthur Scargill, and the confrontation between Arthur Scargill and Margaret Thatcher when the coal miners started striking in the middle of winter. Now, at that point, that was a really important issue. But what I want to do now is just to actually show you what the result of that confrontation was. So if you look at the next graph, you will see the number of people employed in coal mining in the United Kingdom. So in fact, what you see is that the Scargill-Thatcher clash came when coal mining was already under threat in Britain, but now for some decades already, there is no further confrontations between the miners of coal in the UK and the government because there are no miners of coal left in the UK. So Arthur Scargill is without a job, not because he's been sidelined in the union, but because there is no union anymore because there are no coal miners. So we actually see something starting to happen, but the main thing that then actually happens is as communism falls at the end of the 1980s, so you get Reagan and Thatcher's rise. Reagan, of course, also famously had a massive confrontation with the Air Traffic Controllers Union. But effectively, between the two of them, they set the scene for the fall of communism. And after the fall of communism, you see that the whole center-right, center-left thing breaks down, and a lot of people come to power on the basically really not even the center left, the real center of politics. So you see the rise of the so-called third way. That means not communism, but not pure capitalism either. So the people who rise to power, and this comes from the left of the political spectrum. So the three prominent personalities that you might remember from the 1990s, there they are, all together. Bill Clinton, who is from the Democratic Party, but in fact implements all kinds of policies that you would normally associate with a right-wing government. Things like tax increases and spending cuts very strict fiscal policy, etc. And then you get Gerhard Schröder, who is the designer from the center left. Remember that he was the the Social Democrats in Germany, but he reforms labor laws in Germany to make them much more flexible, turning Germany from a country with very high unemployment and very inflexible labor markets into a situation where there's actually a very flexible labor market in Germany. And of course, you see there Tony Blair, who started governing in Britain and famously supported his friend George Bush in the Iraq War. But actually, the more famous thing is that he took many Thatcherite policies forward under a Labour government. So the thing that actually happens during this third way government, and that was not necessarily, all the consequences were not necessarily foreseen, is that the center-left governments, the third way governments, now start governing with a coalition that doesn't depend primarily on the unions. And so they promote an agenda of much freer markets, which kind of makes sense. If communism doesn't work, let's have some freer markets, but also an agenda of globalization. So the whole idea that this is the end of history, we're no longer at war with each other, but a part of all this chumminess is we are going to allow everybody in the world to trade with each other. So what you see is a massive explosion of world trade. And a lot of people refer to the era between 2000 and 2050 as an era of hyper-globalization. But the thing that you don't necessarily expect in this environment is that this new situation where markets are a lot freer and labor markets are a lot more flexible, and you have a lot more trade, is devastating to the unions. So what you see from the 1990s onward, there was already a small trend, but what you see from the 1990s onwards is a massive decline in union membership. So there you can see union membership in the United States peaking in the 1950s, and actually this graph is not up to date. Effectively now about 10% of workers in the US is unionized, down from roughly 30% in the mid-1950s. So all of these councils where labor and the unions and big business would come together and actually make decisions about how to take the economy forward, none of those councils can work because the unions have lost their power. But one of the severe consequences of this is that political parties which had labor unions as the core of their supporters will now also actually get into some severe trouble. So if we have a look at Germany, what you actually see is after Gerhard Schröder's reforms, union membership in Germany really takes a dive. So you can see that union membership was actually quite stable until the late part of the 20th century, and then it collapses. So what you're seeing is that you have a situation where the unions are devastated, and it also means that the parties, the political parties, depending on the labor unions, go into a very significant decline. So if you look around today, the successor of Tony Blair is not another third-way Labourite. It is actually a fairly right-wing Tory prime minister. What you see in Germany is not another social democrat, but actually the long reign of a Christian Democrat, the record reign of Angela Merkel. And what you see in America, of course, is also not another Bill Clinton, but rather a Donald Trump. Now, the interesting thing is that the decline of the labor unions and the rise of the professional classes to some extent, because what you see is that in the labor markets of the Western countries, there's a big shift away from blue-collar work and blue-collar laborers to much more professional workers. So actually graduates and professional people become much more important in the population, and also the population becomes much more urban. So you see a large shift. But what you see is that the former labor union members are now not being taken care of. So effectively, they are orphans. They are no longer being looked after by the unions because the unions have lost their power, and they no longer feel the affiliation with the unions that used to reliably bring them out to vote for the center-left parties. So effectively, that has two consequences. The one consequence is the loss of power across Europe and basically across the world of the center-left parties. But it also means that those union members are now no longer being led by moderate people. So they are up for grabs politically. At the same time, of course, we also see some other shifts. So whereas in the past, you thought that the right-wing coalitions, remember that those two in the 1950s and 60s in most of these countries, you would see participation in elections of more than 80% in most elections in countries across Europe and the West, and that there would be small margins between the left-wing and the right-wing parties. The left-wing parties having their core Labour supporters, and the right-wing parties being a coalition of the business, small business, and also of the professional classes. But what you see now is that you see a shift in the right-wing parties, and it differs on whether you actually have proportionate representation or whether you have single party or single party government. So in the two countries where you typically have single party government, Britain and the United States, what you see is that the thing that happens is that the right-wing parties start to lose the professional classes as their supporters, but they start to gain the blue-collar workers as their supporters. So there's a shift in the support of the right-wing parties. And the left-wing parties obviously has the opposite. They start losing the blue-collar workers, of which there are now far fewer, and they start to gain the professional classes. And it's interesting that people with degrees in both Britain and in the US would 20 years ago have mostly in America have supported the Republicans, and in Britain supported the Conservative Party. It's now the other way around. People with degrees by a large majority now prefer the left-wing parties. But the more interesting thing actually happens in Europe. So just to conclude the story of the consequences of this hyperglobalization, the percentage of trade around the globe goes from just more than 10% to around 30%. So effectively, a much larger portion of what people buy is imported, and a much larger portion of what people produce is exported. And really the beneficiaries of this trend are the Chinese and the Indians. So there's a massive increase in the living standards in China, especially, but also in India. And to some extent, there's a devastation of the blue-collar areas in both Europe, Britain, and the United States. Amazing that you now have to say Britain separate from Europe. But effectively, who are the people that we're talking about? We're talking about the factory workers in the Western countries who used to be unionized and actually get quite high wages and be somewhat mollycoddled by their governments, and their governments would be really careful even the right-wing governments, not to offend those people because they might turn communist. But after the fall of communism, of course, that threat goes away, so the concern for those people among the elites in Western countries actually goes away. So what we now see is we see the rise of nationalist right-wing populists. So let's start in Britain. We actually see a guy called Nigel Farage. And he's actually starts off as a person who's not really mainstream at all. He's a kind of very peripheral figure that has this funny notion that Britain should exit the European Union. So there he sits, the father of Brexit, Nigel Farage. And he uses the democratic system. He doesn't actually rise up in protest and start a terrorist movement. He uses the democratic system. There he sits as a member of the European Parliament, elected in Britain, actually. And he propagates the idea of the independence of the United Kingdom from the European Union. And obviously this eventually becomes a mainstream thing. But it's actually much more prominent in places where you have proportional representation. Because there, the people with some funny ideas about especially nationalist and I guess nationalism is the best way to describe it, but it's an anti-immigrant agenda, and it's a nationalism that says we don't want to trade with everybody in the world. We don't want to have immigration. We want to return to our national roots. And it also has a strong element, typically, of social conservatism. So it would be aligned with conservative religious situations, for instance. But we also, the best example of this really probably is the Nationalist Party in France with, first of all, Jean-Marie Le Pen, and then his daughter, Marine Le Pen, who actually becomes the second strongest party in France in many ways. But before they even really became prominent, we see the rise of a businessman who is also a media figure, who then takes over the government in a prominent country. His name, of course, is Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. So how does Silvio Berlusconi rise to prominence? He mobilizes the old working classes for a right-wing cause. So what we're seeing across Europe, especially in those countries with proportionate representation, is that there's a strong increase in the support of radical right-wing people, and some of them actually make it into government. So if we move on, we actually see that this is not only Silvio Berlusconi. There you see Sebastian Kurz, now actually a very young person, but he is now the Chancellor of Austria. So in Austria, the right-wing party has actually taken power because they have the swing vote. So the left-wing parties have been sidelined. So you get some fairly radical left-wing parties, but they get small support. So the remnants of the old center-left parties get basically split up three ways. They either go a very light pink form of social democracy, or they go radical left. So you would think of people like the Squad in the US, Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and so on, really far left-wing people. And then a large part of the original base actually absconds to the far right wing. So they actually go from being the core pillar of left-wing politics to being the supporters of the far right. So if you had thought that Donald Trump was the only person with this type of populist far-right agenda, nationalist agenda, to come to power. You would be wrong. Effectively, you actually see that in a lot of other places. Boris Johnson is actually an example of that as well. But if you think of Germany, for instance, there's a party called the Alternative for Germany. And this Alternative for Germany is now actually at the point where it is becoming so strong that even though the Germans have a great reluctance to actually entertain anything right-wing after the whole Nazi debacle, they actually are starting to be included in some coalitions at state level in the Länder in Germany. So the interesting thing for those of us who follow the, let's just say, the English-speaking world, is the first thing that we really saw of this was Brexit. And then the second thing was we see something called the Blue Wall in the United States come to an end, and that actually heralds the defeat of Hillary Clinton. So once Hillary Clinton gets defeated by Donald Trump, everybody says, what happened to the Democrats' Blue Wall? So what was the Blue Wall? It was the unionized voters in the northeast of the United States. So Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, those type of areas. So really where the core industrial production of the US took place, there were these workers who were very loyal Democrats. So they were so loyal that they were described as the Blue Wall, and they decided that they wanted to vote for Donald Trump rather than Hillary Clinton. But as you can see now, once you take a global perspective of this is not a unique thing that Donald Trump brought about. It's something, it's a worldwide trend that Donald Trump happens to be the beneficiary of. And then you see the corollary of this is that the people who voted for Brexit, and you could have said that it was because the Labour leader at the time was not really interested in staying in the European Union. He wanted to build socialism in a separate United Kingdom. But we see eventually that when the election comes around and people are put on the spot about Brexit in an actual election, the so-called red wall in the UK, which was the Labour Party supporters, actually votes for Boris Johnson. And suddenly Boris Johnson has a large majority in the UK. So the thing that I really just want to point out is that when you're thinking about Donald Trump, and to some extent when you're thinking about Boris Johnson, it's tempting to say, but you know what, this is actually Rupert Murdoch's fault, because Rupert Murdoch owns all of the newspapers and he's propaganda for these right-wing candidates. So if you're thinking about it, a part of the strategy of winning the allegiance of these populist-leaning voters is what we would normally describe as fake news. So what you would do is you would take an issue that seems peripheral and you build on it to the point where it becomes a really important issue. So if you think about the election in 2016, there were actually people who pitched up wanting to arrest Hillary Clinton or stop Hillary Clinton from her pedophilic activities that was propagated on the internet. So you have these weird and wonderful stories. So QAnon in the US is one of those things. But really one of the things that they wanted to promote against Joe Biden this in the 2020 election was the idea that Joe Biden and his son Hunter are supremely corrupt and that they were involved in these massively corrupt activities in the Ukraine. Now, I think that there's no doubt that it is inappropriate for someone who's the son of the Vice President of the United States to take a position on a board in the Ukraine of an oil company in the Ukraine, which can be influenced by the United States. So there's a whiff of inappropriateness to start with. But now they're trying to build this into something serious. So the first thing is they try to get the president of the Ukraine to formally institute a case against Hunter Biden. And they basically threatened to hold back military aid against the Russians in order to achieve this. And that's why Trump gets impeached eventually. But then the media takes up the same story, and they happen to find fictitiously in October an abandoned laptop of Hunter Biden's, and they alert the Wall Street Journal to this. Because the Wall Street Journal, of course, is a Trump-supporting newspaper owned by Rupert Murdoch. But the Wall Street Journal has as its main commercial function, they are focused on financial markets. So they are not really keen to take up scurrilous accusations. So they refuse to actually take up the story. So what they do is they take the story to the New York Post, which is also owned by Rupert Murdoch, but whose main fare is scurrilous stories, and they publish it. But then actually Twitter bans references to these stories because they actually regard it as unproven. But what they then do is they get some of Rupert Murdoch's Australian TV shows to do stories about this, and then they start spreading these clips around the internet to the extent that I start receiving these clips from Australia, from some of my friends. So effectively what happens is there's a massive social media rumor spreading machine that is not always being applied to spread, let's just say, peace and love. It really spreads hate and conflict. But the point about it is that there's a whole class of people who sits ready to receive this message of conflict and of the fact that there are this class of people who don't care about them, the swamp, effectively, and that these people should be removed from power because they are supremely corrupt, and they should be replaced by these wonderful people who tend to be media personalities. So if you think about Donald Trump, he's not really a businessman, he's really a media personality. So these media personalities try to replace the proper politicians, and the interesting thing is that they are extremely effective. So what we're seeing at this stage is we don't see the resurgence of trade unions because the restructuring of the economy that has happened, that has basically moved most manufacturing out of the Western countries into Asia. There is no union movement to research because there just aren't enough blue-collar workers left. So it's the descendants of those blue-collar workers who also don't have an education but now can't get a well-paying job that are susceptible to all kinds of maladies, including so-called deaths of despair. So suicides, drugs, all of those type of things flourish in those areas where there used to be flourishing industries that employed lots of blue-collar workers. But in the West, there's a gradual transition away from that. So effectively, most of those people are being educated, and they eventually turn into knowledge workers rather than blue-collar workers. But in the meantime, they are a strong base of support for right-wing leaning parties, but not the center-right, normal right-wing parties that we saw that was basically trying to support a normal, let's say, right-wing agenda, much more nationalistic type of agendas that comes out of that. And it's actually, if you look across the European Union, Hungary, Poland, this is not something that is limited, but it also evokes a restructuring of the left-leaning parties or the more liberal parties. So what you sometimes see in reaction to this right-wing, or let's say the move to a further right-wing, more nationalist agenda on the right wing of politics, is that you get a new dispensation on the left as well. So Emmanuel Macron comes along and he completely restructures French politics, gets elected on a platform not of one of the major parties of old, but on a completely new platform. And Emmanuel Macron gets elected as the prophet of European integration, effectively. So it's not impossible that you actually get a pushback against that again, but effectively you get a very different alignment than you had before. So the old alignment of left and right splits up and becomes something new entirely. And one of the big things that now becomes an issue is the whole question of global warming. So across the world, there are a large number of people who are extremely concerned about global warming. And in Europe, they tend to join the Green Party. So what you see is that in Germany, when the Christian Democrats wants to govern, one of the options is always to govern with the Green Party. So as long as they take on board the agenda of cleaning up the environment and fighting global warming, you can depend on the Greens to support you. And there's a strong movement that supports the Green Party. But the Green Party, because of its single issue status, it's difficult for them to become a really large party, but they're getting large enough to be a good coalition party in those countries where you have proportionate representation. Of course, in Britain and in the United States, you don't have proportionate representation, so you actually don't see a massive Green Party movement. In the same way that the really nationalist right-wing stuff gets taken up by the right-wing parties, the green issues gets taken up by the left-wing parties. So for all practical purposes, there is a new route to power for the center-left, but it's a completely new agenda. It doesn't start with the unions and protecting the unions. Those supporters of the unions are actually absconding to the right-wing nationalist parties, but it depends on taking along the new intelligentsia, the knowledge workers, and marrying them with the old-style liberals, and effectively you then have an agenda that says we want to reform the economy and we want to fight climate change. So to some extent, climate change becomes the seminal issue rather than left-wing or right-wing government interference or high taxes or whatever. To a very large extent, if you think about the left-wing part of the Democratic Party, they propagate something called the Green New Deal, and they get a lot of support for that. So those of you who follow Greta Thunberg, she's basically the poster girl of the single issue climate change agenda. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that having gotten the industrial workers as their support base, so those industrial workers don't only include factory workers, they also include people who are basically involved in coal mining. So in the United States, you see that the coal mining states are massive Trump supporters. And then, of course, the mining of oil and the fracking, the whole oil industry is also very much in support of this right-wing nationalism, and climate denial or climate change denial becomes a central plank of this in many cases. Now, interestingly enough, Boris Johnson also takes on board climate change as one of his issues. So although he focuses on the nationalist issues that are important to those ex-industrial workers, so he gets the red wall on his side. Remember, in Britain, the Conservative Party is blue and Labour is red. In the United States, the Democrats are blue and the Republicans are red, so kind of an inverse thing. So the blue wall and the red wall are the same thing. They just use different colors in different countries. But essentially what happens in politics is you've got to have a new agenda. But a very important part of the, let's just say, the right-leaning agenda becomes, in many places, climate change denial, certainly from Donald Trump. And in the US, certainly in terms of the whole oil and coal industries, they promote climate change denial, and you have to do that, otherwise they won't support you. But on the left, you get the liberal left-wingers, meaning the educated professional classes who live in the suburbs. Donald Trump liked to talk about the suburban housewives, and he was able to really get under the skin of many women by calling them housewives. So something reminiscent of the 1950s. But effectively, the suburban professionals support a much more, let's say, liberal agenda that includes serious climate change efforts, or serious efforts to stop climate change. So a whole new thing, but the main issue that I just actually want to point out in this is that Donald Trump is not a unique person who is doing something unique in the United States. It is a person that is jumping on board a trend that is actually identifiable globally in all the old industrial nations. So effectively, does this trend actually apply in India? And the answer is, to some extent, yes. Narendra Modi is a much more nationalist politician and a much more, so if you want to call it that, Hindu nationalist. Now, to some extent, you have to say that the creation of India was the creation of Hindustan. So promoting Hindu values and Hindu interests is to some extent Indian nationalism, although India also accommodates the largest portion of Muslims in the world. Hindu nationalism. So the whole nationalism thing is also strong in India. But really, India was never industrialized. So it's not as if this is being focused on an industrialized working class. This is focused more on the religious stuff. In Japan, interestingly, you also get the more right-leaning. If you look at Shinzo Abe, the previous premier of Japan, much more right-leaning than his predecessors, much more nationalist than his predecessors, also prepared to be much more positive about military might in Japan, which has really been a pacifist country since the Second World War, and really also getting the industrial workers in Japan on his side through his more nationalist type rhetoric. But Japan actually never allowed a lot of either imports or, in fact, immigration. So he's basically continuing a long tradition in Japan. But in other Asian countries, you don't really see much of this because they've been the beneficiary of this trend. So where has the manufacturing gone? It's gone from the United States and Britain and Europe to China, and to some extent to India, but mostly to China and other Eastern countries. And of course there, if you're a communist, you don't tolerate independent unions. So the whole idea that the unions will play a large part on it doesn't actually feature in that portion. But interestingly, you also see President Xi being much more nationalist than his predecessors. So Chinese power and the fact that the Chinese should hold their own in international relations becoming a much stronger issue in China. But so this new prosperity that was brought by this globalization actually now bringing forth leaders who don't necessarily believe in globalization. So again, an unintended consequence of this whole transition to globalization. So the idea of the Clintons and the Blairs of allowing China to become part of the World Trade Organization is that you will integrate them into the Western way of doing things, and you would make it impossible for them to leave or to have major conflict with the West. Well, we're seeing the opposite of that. We're actually seeing a leaning towards more radicalism in China. And so the eventual question is, what does that mean for South Africa? So it's interesting to also look at the unions in South Africa. Now, of course, if you look at South Africa, the first thing is that you did have unions in South Africa with strong political influence. They were the white unions who supported the National Party. So what we have to remember in South Africa, of course, is in the 1920s, the Communist Party led a strike on the reef in the gold mines with the slogan, "Workers of the world unite for a white South Africa." So they were trying to exclude black workers and trying to prevent black workers from pushing white wages down. So the National Party took that trend on board, and they basically kept the blue-collar white worker on board. But through the 1980s, those blue-collar white workers also started dissipating because they were being replaced, actually, by black workers. So black workers moved into the more skilled jobs, and the whole idea of white workers, blue-collar workers, basically became obsolete. But effectively, those people were a strong source of support for the Conservative Party and for the HNP. But effectively, those trends were subsumed by the whole transition to black majority rule in South Africa. And part of that move to black majority rule was an initial push to get unions into the mining industry. So Cyril Ramaphosa's rise is as the leader of the NUM, the major union in the mining industry. But what we see today is that the NUM actually represents very few workers still in South Africa. In fact, in the mining industry, the NUM has been replaced by AMCU, which is a significant, more radical union not aligned to the ANC. So who is the base of COSATU today? And the interesting answer is that COSATU is, for all practical intents, a public sector union. So in South Africa, there's also been a realignment, but as the ANC has come to power, they have supported or they have favored their client base or their voter base by expanding the civil service and having that expanded civil service join the COSATU union. So AMCU and NAHAWU, the nurses and the teachers, are now the core of COSATU rather than the NUM, which was its origins. So a very different animal, certainly no blue-collar labor union anymore. So in fact, the blue-collar labor union in South Africa would now be AMCU, maybe there's also some other moves to take more of the industrial workers, but industrial work in South Africa has also been dissipated, and therefore there's no strong union, blue-collar union base to basically exploit. So South Africa has its own unique characteristics, and really to a very large extent, South Africa is dominated by the political shenanigans inside the ANC. The last thing I want to comment on today before we sign off is that the United States, in many ways, with this breakdown of the old order of two center parties who basically split power between themselves and govern as a national elite, with this breakdown, they are starting to behave more and more like a third world country. So there was a news item yesterday on the news scene saying oil-rich country has disputed election and uncertainty reigns. Of course, you would think that they're referring to Angola, but they're not. They're referring to the United States. So we actually have a previous president who's refusing to accept the results of an election. There are major allegations of fraud, which is kind of quite normal in places like Angola. And of course, the United States, the biggest producer of oil in the world today. But also, in a political way, they're starting to look a little bit more like a third world country, certainly not like a country where you have a very civilized interaction with each other, and where there's an elite that rules, and basically it's either the slightly left-wing leaning elite or the slightly right-wing leaning elite who governs. So that whole thing is breaking down. The other thing is that in terms of the way that it has handled the COVID epidemic, America looks a lot more like Brazil and India than they look like Europe. So again, they're starting to look in many ways like a third world country. So whether this trend continues or not, it's just a very interesting observation that even though the United States is still the major power in the world and still the richest country in the world, in many ways they are taking on aspects of third world countries. And really the core of that is the absolutely conflicted nature of politics in the new era of social media. But that new era of social media, I know that a lot of people blame that for the antagonistic politics, but really it found a very fertile bed in these abandoned blue-collar workers, and that trend is not going away. So in the end, if you're looking forward, the political issues will center to a very large extent around the cultural issues of nationalism versus, but it's interesting that these cultural nationalists actually support each other across borders. So Nigel Farage campaigned for Donald Trump. So even though globalization is something they abhor, they actually align themselves globally with other nationalists. So there's a kind of funny thing that happens there as well. But that trend and how that trend goes forward will be a very interesting part. And the other big thing that we need to watch in politics is how does the support for action on climate change develop? Because that's the other issue that really attracts strong passions. So separate from nationalism and let's say social conservatism, the whole question of are you supportive of the green agenda is becoming really important. Maybe just a little last comment on current news. One of the things we've said before is that markets look to see whether the president and the Senate goes with the same party, and that if it goes with the same party, there is the ability to take action to stimulate the economy, and that is generally regarded as better for markets. What we've seen since the election is actually a funny thing happening. The expected blue wave for the Democratic Party didn't quite materialize. It was strong enough to bring Joe Biden in, but it wasn't strong enough to give clear control of the Senate to the Democrats. So in fact, for the moment, the Senate remains in the control of the Republicans while the presidency is going to the Democrats. And contrary to expectations, the markets now interpret this extremely positively. And the main thing is that in the short run, they reckon that what this means is it does mean mostly that there won't be as much stimulus going into the economy. But by the way, that means that interest rates will stay very low, because if you don't have fiscal stimulus, you actually have to get the stimulus from the Federal Reserve on the one hand. But the other thing they feel that this means is that there will not be a tax rise. So effectively, the tax cut promoted by Donald Trump will be protected by the Republican Senate. So you're locking in the fiscal status quo, meaning low taxes and fairly low spending, which the markets like on the one hand, but you're also getting rid of the disruptive side of Donald Trump. So the one thing that Donald Trump has promoted that markets has always disliked is the whole question of trade wars. You will have seen, if you watched markets over the last 4 years, that every time Donald Trump announces more or a sharpening of the trade war with China, then actually markets came down. So effectively, you're getting someone who is less inclined to make a trade war, which is again an inversion of what would have happened 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the left-leaning parties were more likely to have trade wars, and the right-leaning parties promoted free trade. We now have the opposite. We have a right-leaning party promoting trade wars, and a left-leaning party being more trade-orientated. But what we have to say is that in general, there will be a trend towards less trade promotion, and the growth of exports as a percentage of GDP is likely to become significantly lower because of this trend towards right-wing populism. Now, in the short run, of course, if Joe Biden is the president, we get less of that populism in US policy making. And the one thing that the president can do pretty much on his own, doesn't really need a lot of support from Congress, is foreign policy. So we see a return to the Obama-Biden foreign policy pretty much. So we don't think that Biden will do some stuff very different from what happened under the Obama-Biden administration. And also this is a trade-friendly environment in principle. So far less likely to get sanctions and all kinds of tariffs, etc. But we actually have a situation where there will be very little movement on the fiscal front, which, if you're an economist, is actually not necessarily the right way to go. I think economists in general agree that some significant fiscal stimulation into the US economy towards the end of the pandemic would be a good thing. But unlikely to happen while you have the Republicans in Congress and you have a Democratic president. The very last comment on the vaccine, it seems like one of the things that people have worried about is that the first vaccine to become available would be a fairly ineffective one. You would have a low percentage of people protected. The trials they've done up to now, 43,000 people involved in the trials, the phase 3 trials of the new Pfizer vaccine, indicates that 90% of people it's up to 90% effective, meaning 90% of people get protection from it, which is actually a very high level for a vaccine. So that looks very positive. So it looks like your herd immunity might be within reach. However, the other thing is that this is a vaccine that needs to be kept at a very low temperature. So it's a vaccine that may be very effective in developed countries where they have the infrastructure to distribute this vaccine at very low temperatures. You know, your whole cold chain needs to be maintained, but it's something that it would be very difficult to implement in places in India and Africa and so on, where the same infrastructure doesn't exist. So it looks like a vaccine that will actually have a major impact in developed countries, but will typically be less effective in less developed countries. Of course, South Africa is one of those rare exceptions where you actually have a large infrastructure that is really first world and can handle these type of things, combined with a large part of the population that is really third world. So no reason to think that we would not be able to effectively distribute and use this vaccine in South Africa. The other comment just is that there are likely to be a significant number of other vaccines that will become available over the next month or two, or maybe 6. But the prospect now is that the we will be able, when we go into winter next year, to have a significant portion of our population vaccinated, certainly the medical professions and the vulnerable parts of the population. Now, maybe not the general population yet, but we'll go into our next winter in a much better shape. And that basically by around mid-year next year, we are likely to see the pandemic waning globally, just because the vaccine will start to be so widely disseminated that really COVID would come under control on a worldwide basis. So some very, very good news. And obviously you would have also seen that markets reacted to this, the Zoom share price zooming downwards for once, but all non-tech companies actually showing very strong growth on the announcement of a vaccine. So that's it from me today. I hope it's something that is of interest to all of you, and that you that will support your analysis over the next year or two of events around the world.
Very interesting, Wikus. Thank you.
Thanks, Wikus. Any questions? While everyone's thinking about it, I thought you might just discuss the ace in the hole.
Yeah, I think that if you Google ace, there's an interesting issue. So again, if we just think about the South African political situation, the situation Ramaphosa found himself in was, when he was elected, is he needed to really do two things. He needed to get to stop the whole state capture corruption issue, but he also needed to reform the finances and economics. And in the NEC of the ANC, there were basically three parties. There was the Zuma faction, the Ramaphosa faction, and COSATU Communist Party faction. And what you found is that Ramaphosa didn't do anything to offend the COSATU Communist Party faction, because he needed to sort out the Zuma faction, which is really also the state capture or corruption faction. And what seems to have happened in the last 2.5 years is that Ramaphosa has clearly come out as the winner against the Zuma faction. So the Zuma faction has been significantly weakened, and the way that it will be weakened further is if a significant number of the corrupt people in government are arrested and prosecuted. And we've always thought that Ace Magashule is the poster boy of those corrupt people. It's someone where there's really books being written about his corruption, but he's not been prosecuted. So if you have something like the Zondo Commission and you bring corruption into the open and you do not prosecute these people, then you're basically saying, I'm giving up about corruption, and that's really had a tremendously negative effect on business confidence. So I think that the prosecution of Ace Magashule will do wonders for business confidence, because it gives people the confidence that Cyril Ramaphosa is in control of the country, and that his agenda, his anti-corruption agenda, first of all, is to the fore. The second thing that happens, of course, is that once you remove the power of the Zuma faction, and let me just actually refer back, there was an NEC meeting about a month or 6 weeks ago, where there was a decision taken that those people prosecuted for corruption need to stand back from their formal positions, not only in government, but in the ANC. So the decision of the NEC actually says that Ace Magashule now needs to stand back and not act as the Secretary General of the ANC. So for all practical purposes, if they follow through on that, and it'll be interesting to see if they do, because that's now where the rubber hits the road. So there's still some work to be done. We'll have to see how they follow through on this. But they've taken the first big important step to say we are prosecuting this person, and but then in terms of the NEC decision, but that NEC decision didn't go through unopposed. Ismagashvili tried to prevent that decision from getting made, but it was made with a substantial majority in the NEC. But then what happens is that once the corrupt faction has been addressed, it opens the way for the right economic policies, which is to actually undermine the power of the unions in government, meaning you've got to actually have fewer civil servants at lower salaries. That wasn't possible up to now, and that has really led to severe problems in the fiscal situation in South Africa. But that might become possible once you eliminate the Ismagashvilis of the world out of the NEC, because it frees you up to govern properly, because you can pay, you need less support from the unions in the NEC. So what I would say is, if you're taking a longer term view, you have to say that it looks like Cyril Ramaphosa's plan is coming together in South Africa.